وعليكم السلام.
وعليكم السلام.
Yeah, we'll give it like 1 minute just to let people come on, inshallah. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah. والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم يا منور يا فتاح، نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وصلي اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We begin in the name of God Almighty. We beseech Him to send His peace and blessings upon our noble messenger and prophet and Master Muhammad, and upon his family and upon his companions and upon all of those who walk in his path of excellence until the last day. So welcome again to this course on the deliverance or the deliverer from error, the sort of autobiographical work of Imam al-Ghazālī, rahimahullah ta'ala. And we actually got to the section now where Imam al-Ghazālī is going to be looking at the divisions of the different philosophical sciences. And so we're in the philosophy section, and this section is probably going to take us some time to get through. And within this section, there's actually a lot of things that I think are really important for us to try to get through. Were there any questions, by the way, from last week before we move forward? You all can also put your cameras on if you like. Makes it nicer for me, at least, to be able to see people. Also, Mabruk, Mubarak, congratulations, everybody. We made it through some craziness. I'm sure that people are, mixed emotions and whatnot, but, it's a good day, alhamdulillah. Okay, so Bismillah. It could be anywhere, but you're here, alhamdulillah, studying المنقذ من الضلال, alhamdulillah. 3 rulings on the Aristotelian school: that which is kufr, that which is bid'ah, and that which is permissible. Yeah. So, and that's what he's going to help us go through within this section. So he says, فصل في أقسام. قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فصل في أقسام علومهم. So the divisions of the philosophical sciences. So he says, اعلم أن علومهم بالنسبة إلى الغرض الذي نطلبه 6 أقسام. So the types of sciences that we're going to look at in relationship to the objectives that we have in relationship to this study of philosophy are 6. رياضية ومنطقية وطبيعية وإلهية وسياسية وخلقية. You have mathematics and logic, and then the natural sciences, which is what we think of as science today, and then metaphysics and politics and ethics. So Imam al-Ghazālī, and as well as actually the Islamic philosophers, are going to divide up philosophy really into 2 components. You have what we talked about last week, the theoretical, and then the practical. The theoretical component, it is things like physics, biology, first philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology would be included in that category. Then you have practical philosophy, which is, really the study of politics and ethics, as he includes it in this section. But the idea behind practical philosophy was to give order to an entire system, like we said, where human beings are seen as the smallest entity, sort of microcosm, and then it reflects outward and upwards to the greater macrocosm. And the idea, this particular idea, will be replicated by Muslim philosophers. Elements of tasawwuf will be adopted from within this basic structure, and a few other Islamic disciplines, one can say as well. But practical philosophy, it's called practical philosophy because it deals with the things that one can change with one's actions. So for example, one's actions on their soul will have an effect on how one orders their intellect, as opposed to the irascible or the animal faculties that one has. Economics has to do with the actions that happen in one's household. So a little different than maybe the way that we think about economics today. But there's a relationship to it. And then politics, which has to do with actions in a city, like the virtues that are related to living amongst one another. So Imam al-Ghazālī is going to look at these disciplines one by one and analyze what they are, what's the issue, ostensibly speaking, what it could be in relationship to. And notice here that we already understand that this framework that he's giving us somewhat maps onto the way that Muslims think about their tradition already. Like there are certain parallels, cognates, that we have within the tradition of Islam already. So then he says, وَأَمَّا الرِّيَاضِيَّةُ فَتَتَعَلَّقُ بِعِلْمِ الْحِسَابِ وَالْهَنْدَسَةِ وَعِلْمِ هَيْئَةِ الْعَالَمِ وليس يتعلق منها شيء بالأمور الدينية نفيا وإثباتا بل هي أمور برهانية لا سبيل إلى مجاحدتها بعد فهمها ومعرفتها. So the first discipline is mathematics. And what's interesting is that this passage really illustrates that al-Ghazālī, number one, endorses mathematics, and he agrees actually with them that the epistemic value that math provides, meaning the certainty that one can have in this form of in this criteria of knowledge, actually does provide one with demonstrative or demonstrable knowledge, i.e. it's absolute. Okay. Now he posits the categories of mathematics. So he says that they include subjects like arithmetic, which is the science of numbers that are discrete. So for instance, you have like 1, 2, 3, 4. Then geometry, which are the science of numbers that are not discrete, so extensions and whatnot. Then astronomy, which is the science of numbers of things in the sky insofar as they are in motion or are changing. Okay, so calculating things as they are in motion. And he actually doesn't mention it here, but the philosophers would also include music as a category, which they understood actually as the science of numbers in ratio. So, and then he shows his orientation towards mathematics. He says, totally fine. It provides demonstrative knowledge. It can't be denied. And then he says, but from this, two issues emerge. إحداهما أن من ينظر فيها فيتعجب من دقائقها ومن ظهور براهينها يحسن بسبب ذلك اعتقاده في الفلاسفة فيحسب أن جميع علومهم في الوضوح ووثاقة البرهان كهذا العلم. So the first issue, he says, is that people are going to assume that because these philosophers were able to provide apodictic knowledge in their mathematics, i.e. certain knowledge when it comes to what they arrive at using mathematics, then they must also have certainty when it comes to their metaphysics, okay, like their beliefs about things that go beyond the realm, as he's saying, of mathematics. In other words, they're so enamored by their skills in math that they assume that everything that the philosophers conclude must be of that same standard. And so if they posit X, Y, and Z in their metaphysics, then that must be true because their method brings about conclusive knowledge. So they're assuming that their brilliance in mathematics must also extend to their metaphysical claims. And that's absolutely false. Okay. This is almost identical to the approach that we find today with people's orientation towards people like Hawking and Dawkins and Dennett, more so like Hawking and Dennett. I mean, Dawkins as well, because he's become kind of a celebrity in his own right. But, you know, you should know that when you read people like this sort of new atheist crowd, when you read them in physics or when you read them in math or in evolutionary biology, that's different than when you read things that they say in metaphysics and philosophy. And that's the crux of the position that Imam al-Ghazālī is saying was also a part and parcel of the issue going on during his time when it comes to the philosophers and the sciences. So he says, ثم يكون قد سمع من كفرهم وتعطيلهم وتهاونهم بالشرع ما تداولته الألسن فيكفر بالتقليد المحض ويقول لو كان الدين حقا لكان لما اختفى على هؤلاء من مع تدقيقهم على هذا أو في هذا العلم. So they hear basically that these skilled mathematicians are non-believers. And so because they're non-believers, people blindly follow them, which is called kufr al-taqlid, right? فَيَكْفُرُ بِالتَّقْلِيدِ الْمَحْض. ويقول, and they say, لو كان الدين حقا لما اختفى على هؤلاء مع تدقيقهم في هذا العلم. Then it wouldn't have gone past them, right? Because they're brilliant, they're geniuses. Look at their mathematics. What's interesting is that, you know, the majority of people reading these scientists, even when we talk about people like Dennett and Hawkins and whatnot, they're also just blindly following what's being said about them. I.e., like, it's not like they actually understand the field and can attest to what their contributions are in their respective fields. Because if they did, they would be much more aware of the nuance to these grand claims than what most of the masses are actually aware of. So this is happening in the same manner, and he's saying they're taking their kufr, they're taking their disbelief then in religion, in God and in religion and whatnot, taqlidan, as a type of imitation, because they see them as authority figures, given their capacity in mathematics. So he says, فإذا عرف بالتسامع كفرهم وجحدهم استدل على أن الحق هو الجحد والإنكار للدين وكم رأيت ممن ضل عن الحق بهذا القدر ولا مستند له سواه. So when he hears that they left religion and these are geniuses in mathematics, then they conclude, well, it must be the case then that there is no truth to religion, and so he leaves religion. Okay. And so Imam al-Ghazālī here says, and how many a man have I seen leave the religion for no other reason than this, right? Subhanallah. So then he says, وإذا قيل له الحاذق في صناعة واحدة ليس يلزم أن يكون حاذقا في كل صناعة فلا يلزم أن يكون الحاذق في الفقه والكلام حاذقا في الطب ولا أن يكون الجاهل بالعقليات جاهلا بالنحو بل لكل صناعة أهل بلغوا فيها رتبة البراعة والسبق وإن كان الخم والجهل قد يلزمهم في غيرها فكلام الأوائل في الرياضيات برهاني وفي الإلهيات تخميني لا يعرف ذلك إلا من جربه وخاض فيه. So this is a very important point here. So he says, look, one could say to somebody that a person who is skilled in one field is not necessarily skilled in every field. So a person who is skilled in jurisprudence and in kalam is not necessarily skilled in medicine, nor is a person who's ignorant of the rational sciences necessarily ignorant of something like grammar. On the contrary, in each field, there are people who have reached in it a certain degree of skill and in preeminence, although they might be quite ignorant about other things. So when what the ancients had to say about math and how it was apodictic, i.e. that it brought about certainty, it actually was apodictic. Whereas their views on metaphysics were actually things of conjecture. But this is only known to someone who has made a thorough study of this matter, i.e. somebody who's actually delved into this. So he's showing us the value of understanding different specializations. Don't confuse what these different specializations actually are capable of arriving at, like what, number one, epistemic standard they have, okay? And what they may be claiming in relationship to a completely different field. Don't confuse what the doctor knows for what the religious scholar knows, and vice versa. Someone who's trained, for instance, as a mental health specialist is not a theologian, and a theologian is not a mental health specialist. And our community actually really need to be able to come to terms with some of these things. I was actually talking about this with Sheikh Jamal the other day, and I asked him, like, why are we so hesitant to this? You know, like, if you're a doctor, you're not a theologian. You don't have the ability to talk about these really complex ideas and philosophical concepts and practice medicine, you know, and let people who do theology and philosophy do that work, and vice versa, right? Like, we kind of understand it to a certain degree when it comes to those assuming that they can just practice medicine because they've been studying it on the side, you know. But for some reason, we assume that specialization when it comes to subjects like theology or religious scholarship, you know, goes outside of that particular boundary. It doesn't. It doesn't. And this is a point of proper literacy in the community, knowing what goes where and getting rid of the ego and uplifting the roles of everybody in our community. Like, we should value the merit of medicine and of doctors, and we should value the merit of artists and of engineers and of lawyers and of teachers and mothers and chefs and scholars, everybody, right? All of them should be utilized for their expertise and should be utilized and should be celebrated for what they do. A community that really flourishes is one that knows how to benefit from the people it has. And the only reason, in my opinion, that they're going to be unable to do that is operationally something has gone wrong. And this could be, I mean, you know, Sheikh Jamal was telling me that this could be actually from untreated trauma, you know, and inferiority complexes, and most importantly, spiritual vices, right? If you don't know how to see yourself as less than in certain respects to those around you, you can't really benefit. وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ, right? وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. Above every possessor of knowledge is somebody who knows more than you. So, you know, we have to be able to know how to benefit from the people around us. And this is extremely important. I mean, for students of knowledge in particular, I would say, listen up. This is something that can really make or break your trajectory in seeking knowledge. If you don't know how to benefit from the masters of this tradition in whatever respect you're studying from, if you don't know how to benefit from them, you're not going to benefit from them. Doesn't matter how much time you spend with them. And it all goes back to being able to understand what goes where and how to actually derive benefit. Anyways, I just gone on a long tangent there. But the point is, Imam al-Ghazālī is not saying all of that. What he's saying is, look, people who are skilled in one discipline does not mean that they are skilled in another discipline. And those who are ignorant in certain things may be very skilled in other things. So the ancients knew how to arrive at apodictic knowledge, certain knowledge when it comes to mathematics, but their metaphysics was pure conjecture, i.e. it's not something that provides a type of epistemic certainty that their math does, okay, or even close. And he says that this point is lost on many people who haven't properly investigated this thoroughly. So then he says, فهذا إذا قرر على هذا الذي ألحد بالتقليد لم يقع منه موقع القبول بل تحمله غلبة الهوى والشهوة البطالة وحب التكايس على أن يصر على تحسين الظن بهم في العلوم كلها فهذه آفة عظيمة لأجلها يجب زجر كل من يخوض في تلك العلوم فإنها وإن لم تتعلق بأمر الدين ولكن لما كانت من مبادئ علومهم صار إليها شرهم وشؤمهم فقل من يخوض فيها إلا وينخلع من الدين وينحل عن رأسه لجام التقوى. So he says, when we make this argument that, look, their mathematics are not like their metaphysics, the philosophers and what they were able to arrive at in terms of their mathematics is different than what they're arriving at in terms of their metaphysics, okay? He says, when we make that argument to someone who has blindly conformed to their positions, then they don't accept it. As a matter of fact, they double down on their position from like the stubborn whims and vanity that they have and their drive to look clever by accepting everything that the philosophers are going to say, right? In all of their sciences. So this is a serious issue. And he says that, this is a serious issue that comes about from those who delve into this science, even though it doesn't have anything to do with this science. It doesn't have anything to do with religion, even though the science, it doesn't have anything to do with religion. And then the famous line that's attributed to al-Ghazālī, right? Yet, since it is a principal science for them, many have been negatively affected by it. And he says, few people have engaged in this science without leaving religion or losing their taqwa, losing their like God consciousness. So what do you all think of that? Any mathematicians in the house?
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. I was actually overhearing he's a Zaytuna professor, I think Yusuf Ismail. He teaches like their astronomy courses.
Yeah.
He went to the Griffith one time, and I caught his tour with them, and he was saying actually now I don't know if it's the level of math people are going towards with, I don't know, some quantum, it's something over my head, quantum physics, I don't know. But he's saying more scientists are actually starting to realize that there's something like in control of the whole universe. And he's like, they're so close to Tawheed, but I don't know if this is like just where we're at currently with mathematics now, as opposed to Imam Ghazali's time.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think that it fluctuates, and that those that are in the field, depending on a variety of reasons, I probably are going to incline towards certain types of philosophical beliefs. But what Imam al-Ghazālī is actually saying is somewhat timeless. I mean, he's saying, look, what they are able to arrive at through the discipline of mathematics, okay, is different than what they are concluding when it comes to metaphysics. Does everybody understand what that means? Okay, so like when they say, we don't believe in any God, we don't believe in any purpose, we don't believe in any afterlife, those are claims that they're making. And they're also coming up with these highly sophisticated mathematical and arithmetical proofs, right, that can be demonstrated in ways that are actually true. And so the assumption becomes on the mind of an individual who's unaware of what's going on here, well, these guys are geniuses. Therefore, everything that they say must be to that level of genius. Therefore, I also now don't believe in any God or right? So that type of sway, okay, is what Imam al-Ghazālī is calling our attention to. He's saying you have to be smarter than that. You have to understand, what is it exactly that these individuals are saying? What is it that they're claiming in relationship to math? What is it that they're claiming then in relationship to these metaphysical claims? Are they the same? Do they provide the same standard of epistemic criteria or not? All right. And so what he's saying is that in his time, he notices that this type of fad is going on. Individuals are kind of looking at these philosophers who are engaged in mathematics in this way, and they're simply just following them blindly, including their metaphysical claims, including saying, we don't believe in any God either. They don't, so we don't. And they assume that they're, right in doing so. And so now Imam al-Ghazālī is saying, this is why delving into this science, i.e. mathematics, is, a serious issue. Okay? Because a person who's doing this, when you try to show them that metaphysics and physics are separate, okay, they've already followed blindly and they double down on their claim. They don't leave that which they've come to know now from your argument. And he says that because they're stubborn and whatnot, they're going to stay. And as a matter of fact, they're just going to, blindly conform to everything the philosophers hold. And so then he says, it's because of this and because this science is a principal science for the philosophers, that many have been negatively affected by this, and few have engaged it, i.e. mathematics, without leaving religion or losing their taqwa. Okay, so what does he mean here? And does this really mean that Ghazali wrote off mathematics? Or that he claimed that it was satanic? Or that, what was understood by the scholars succeeding al-Ghazali was that, in fact, mathematics should not be something that pious Muslims do? The answer is no, no, and no. Okay, I'm sure that you all have seen that Neil deGrasse Tyson YouTube clip. If you haven't, look it up. Okay, look it up. This Neil deGrasse Tyson clip saying something just really, it's stupid. It's a very stupid claim that he makes about Imam al-Ghazali and the that which follows from what he's claiming Imam al-Ghazali posited in terms of the rational sciences in the Islamic, the post-classical Islamic period. And so he kind of says, like, look, Imam al-Ghazali says mathematics is from the devil. And then after Imam al-Ghazali, all of these Muslims no longer delved into mathematics and, all of the sciences that obviously would entail from that. And the Muslims have yet to really revive the type of scientific golden age that they had prior to Imam al-Ghazali saying what he said. Okay. First off, there wasn't a decline in the study of mathematics after Imam al-Ghazali. The golden age of astronomy in the Islamic world actually was yet to come, right? with Ghazali. The post-classical period, the integration of Avicennan philosophy into mainstream Sunnism, and then the rational pursuits had really yet to flourish, one can say. So for example, you can point to the works of people like At-Tusi, Al-Katibi. You have the observatory in Maraghe, which is in East Azerbaijan. It's in the province of Iran. And this was actually established in the 13th century. Okay, so basically an entire century and a half after Imam al-Ghazali passed away. And then you also have people like Ala ad-Din Ali al-Qushti, al-Mahbubi, al-Samarqandi. You have the observatory in Samarkand. Okay, these are just a few names and institutions actually that prove this idea false. So the stars that Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about as having Arabic names that came from this golden era, actually, a lot of them came after Imam al-Ghazali from these observatories. Okay. So there's another follow-up to this. If you read Imam al-Ghazali in the Ihya, in the revivification of the Islamic sciences, he actually says that mathematics is a fard kifaya, which means that it's a communal obligation. Communal obligation, meaning that someone in the Muslim community needs to establish this science and everything that it would entail in properly establishing it in the community. And if they don't, the entire society is sinning. That's what a fard kifaya means. Okay. And then he actually says not having people who specialize in mathematics will actually harm society. And isn't it interesting? I always think about this. Isn't it interesting that Imam al-Ghazali talks about various types of knowledge as an egoistic endeavor, right? Like they're using it to advance their ego, okay? And because of that, he says, it then creates vices in society and in the individual rather than benefit. Okay? So it's not because the discipline is bad, but because the human being can use it in a way that brings about harm. Individual can also use it in a way that brings about a lot of benefit. And this is something that you'll see not just, in his discussion about mathematics, but in a variety of other sciences, particularly rational sciences or demonstrative sciences. So it's not an issue of math, it's an issue of ego and of caprice and stubbornness that uses the epistemic merit of math improperly, right? And so he's going to further explain this as he goes on, but this is the first issue that he talks about when it comes to the issues that can emerge out of delving into mathematics, okay? The second issue now, he says, نشأت من صديق للإسلام جاهل ظن أن الدين ينبغي أن ينصر بإنكار كل علم منسوب إليهم فأنكر جميع علومهم وادعى جهلهم فيها حتى أنكر قولهم في الخسوف والكسوف وزعم أن ما قالوه على خلاف الشرع. Okay. So the second one, he says, emerges from someone who assumes that he's Mr. Islam, right? Like Mr. Pious Muslim person. And he says, and this person's ignorant. All right. And so what do they claim? This person claims, well, look, these philosophers' metaphysics is bunk. Therefore, their math is wrong and their physics, everything else that they do is also wrong. So they reject anything that's attributed to them, even when it comes to their statements about eclipses and astronomical assertions. They say, all of this is actually in opposition to the Sharia. All right. فلما قرأ ذلك سمع من عرفه بالبرهان القاطع لم يشك في برهانه ولكن اعتقد أن الإسلام مبني على الجهل والإنكار وإنكار البرهان القاطع فازداد للفلسفة حبا وللإسلام بغضا. Very important point. So what happens then? Okay, what happens is that one comes to realize that, well, when it comes to, their mathematics, the philosophers' mathematics, that actually does carry demonstrative knowledge. And then they hear that Islam denies this. Therefore, Islam denies something that is demonstrative. And so all this does, Imam al-Ghazālī says, is increase one's affection towards this other group, and it makes them see Islam as something stupid, mundane, right? Like they don't know what they're talking about. This is so profound. He's saying this in the 11th century, by the way. And, it goes back to what's going on in our time. And mind you that the way in which science is developed in, this early pre-modern period, this classical period of Islam, is significantly different than the way that science is developed today. Science is today, when you look at specialization, for instance, in the field of medicine, you're talking about like, people that just specialize in like the eye, just the eye, right? And that could be like a lifetime of study if one actually wanted to actually go through the entirety of what could be taught. Similarly, in a variety of other fields, right? So, in other words, there has been a massive expansion when it comes to knowledge in the modern period. So when it comes to people who really haven't properly specialized in this and don't really have, an understanding as to what goes where and what's what, in a sense, they can speak about these things in a way that's extremely ignorant. When they tie that back to Islam, then they make Islam look like it's the ignorant thing out there, right? And we see what type of damage this can do to people in the community. وَلَقَدْ عَظُمَ عَلَى الدِّينِ جِنَايَةُ مَنْ ظَنَّ أَنَّ الْإِسْلَامَ يُنْصَرُ بِإِنْكَارِ هَذِهِ الْعُلُومِ وَلَيْسَ فِي الشَّرْعِ تعرض لهذه العلوم بالنفي والإثبات ولا في هذه العلوم تعرض للأمور الدينية. Okay, and so he says, look, refuting these aspects of the science, i.e. the demonstrative aspects of science, and claiming that it is for religious purposes, you have committed a crime against religion. And they think, these people that do this, think that they're protecting religion. He says, you're not protecting religion when you deny demonstrative science, okay? What can be established properly as providing epistemic certainty, when you assume that you're going to deny this and that somehow is going to protect religion, you're fooling yourself. You're actually harming it in the mind of others. And you're harming religious people actually by extension. Right? And these are two separate issues. But it's fascinating to me the way in which much of the disposition, particularly in the West, and this can be something that's said of postmodern period, looks at religion in this sort of light, like it's a number of claims that these people adhere to that make absolutely no sense. There's no reason or rhyme to it whatsoever. And that it's somehow anti-science and anti-fact or something like that. This is done when individuals from within these religious camps speak about things that they don't properly have an understanding of. And the damage that it can do can be something that is extremely long-lasting. And, when it's there and it becomes set in a society in that manner, I mean, subhanAllah, ostensibly that is what we're looking at today. And some individuals may say, well, look, the majority of people believe in God, and there's some kind of, they may not believe in religion all the same in the way that they did in the pre-modern period, but there's still a kind of acceptance of God and spirituality. Yes, that's true, maybe to a certain extent, but what is the disposition that they have towards religion? All right, what is the disposition? I'll give you an example of this. I was walking once. I was at a conference in Washington, D.C. And I was walking, and it's interesting that it's D.C., right? I was just walking in the street, and a variety of people, and this was obviously before COVID, a bunch of people outside on the street, and this group of individuals who had kind of gathered in a corner. They had signs, religious signs, and you could tell like they were like younger people who were out there like advocating for religion and, you know, Christianity and proselytizing and whatnot. Okay, so one of them came up to me and they said, "Hi, excuse me, sir, just wondering, would you like us to pray for you for anything? Like, is there anything that you want us to pray for you for?" And there were some people behind me and they heard the same thing. They actually asked them the same thing. Like, can we pray for you? Like, is there something that you need for us to pray for you? Mind you, we're in the middle of the street, public, you know, like just some random people come to you and ask you, "Hey, can we pray for you for something?" Now, immediately I thought like, man, that is incredible. Like there's an aspect of that that's just like really profound. Like, sure. You know, that's what a nice thing. Like, thank you. And so I told them like, yeah, you know, I have a nephew who has been affected by cancer. Alhamdulillah, he's doing better now, but can you keep him in your prayers? You know, whatever. I said, yeah, sure. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. And I kept walking. People behind me who also got asked that same question, they said like, no, we're good. And they kind of, you know, were weirded out and they kept walking. The entire time now I'm sort of walking in front of these people and they're behind me. The entire time that I'm walking, these individuals behind me are making fun of these people, these you know, religious advocates outside on the street asking people, can they pray for them? Like, oh, you know, what a stupid thing to say. Like, what do you mean pray for me? Yeah, you can pray for me. You can pray that I, you know, whatever. And I remember hearing this and thinking to myself, like, that is actually living in this country in particular and living in the time that we live in. Okay. That almost becomes the intuitive response. Like that becomes the disposition that many people have towards hearing something like that from people in public. Like you're opposed to somebody coming up to you and asking you, can I pray for you? It seems like so stupid and weird and like, what are you doing? Okay. Whereas in reality, it's not. And as a matter of fact, when you go into your religious space, that becomes something that is quite normal. And these individuals actually that are making fun of it in the public arena, I don't doubt. As a matter of fact, there was one of them had a necklace on with a cross. You know what I mean? So what does that say? What that says to me, at least, is that you've created this society, this ecosystem where your belief in God doesn't really amount to anything in reality. It's simply an identity that you carry in the same way that you carry a type of nationality. You know, like somebody says like, I'm Irish Catholic. Well, you know, I had a friend of mine who would say I'm Irish Catholic. And then when we got into discussion about religion, he was actually an atheist, you know? So what does that mean? Why do you say that you're an Irish Catholic and you don't even believe in God? And he says, well, it's, you know, there's a separation between the Catholics and the Protestants in that area. So it becomes kind of an identity for them, right? So the point is in all of this that, you know, what is it that is actually being understood when it comes to how religion informs one's worldview in reality, like out there in public, particularly in a society that assumes that really all that religion has to say is almost anti-facts. You know, they're beliefs that you carry that don't really have anything to do with things like mathematics and science and rationalism and these kinds of things. And this was done particularly in the way that it's become kind of understood in the Western modern world. It was done by religious people themselves, right? A huge element of this came from religious folks themselves, and it continues to be cemented in this way, right? So Allahu a'lam, but that's kind of. So this is, refuting aspects of this science, the demonstrative aspects, like we said, and then claiming that it's for religious purposes is really, a type of misguidance. Like that's not what you're harming religion by doing that. The Sharia is not asserting itself to be a text or a book that's elaborating on what is being elaborated on in these sciences. Okay, nor are these sciences, particularly when we talk about mathematics here, asserting themselves in that manner. And this is what Imam al-Ghazālī is trying to call our attention to. So it comes back again to simply understanding what goes where, what is within the boundaries or scope of each of these different subjects, of each of these different issues. So then he says, وَقَوْلُهُ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ إِنَّ الشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ آيَتَانِ مِنْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ لَا يُخْسَفَانِ لِمَوْتِ أَحَدٍ وَلَا لِحَيَاتِهِ ولكن الله تعالى إذا تجلى لشيء خضع له فإذا رأيتم ذلك فافزعوا إلى الصلاة ويروى إلى ذكر الله تعالى. So he gives an example here. Okay. So he gives an example here. So look, these individuals who assume that they have to reject everything that the philosophers say, like including their mathematics, okay? One of the ways that they try to do this is they say, look, we're going to reject these mathematical and these arithmetical demonstrations with statements from hadiths, like prophetic traditions, okay? So for example, when an astronomer claims, as they purported, particularly in the classical period, that eclipses occur because a celestial body interposes itself between the sun and the moon and whatever other eclipses one might have, and that this is an explanation, okay, based on certain criteria that we deem certain when it comes to how an eclipse actually takes place. These religious individuals, okay, who are misguided, they come and say, no, that's not true. The Prophet ﷺ said, the sun and the moon are two signs of God, and they're not eclipsed for the death or life of anyone. And if Allah manifests himself to anything, i.e. like his creation, it humbles itself before him. So you see, so when you see it, flee to prayer or to the remembrance of God, according to one narrations. And so they say, so see, it's not the moon moving in an orbit around the earth and at the same time the earth orbits the sun. It's God manifesting himself to it. That's what's actually happening, and what they're saying is false. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Could it just be that the manifestation statement or the jelly statement is not related? I'm not sure. I mean, when you read it, I didn't see it as the jelly being related to the eclipse, but that's what I understood.
Yeah, you're saying tajalli, right? Like the manifesting, right?
Yeah, Yeah, I felt like the manifesting wasn't really. Yeah, so.
So what would you say to somebody who said to you, "Hey, listen, these astronomers are making claims about eclipses, and they say that it happens because a celestial body interposes itself between the sun and the moon, where we know that actually it's Allah manifesting himself to it, and then as a result of which it humbles itself before him."
If they don't contradict each other, I mean, it could be both true, and we're not experts to deny the maybe self-evident or whatever, however we came to the conclusion that how eclipse happened, but it's also the statement of the Prophet ﷺ is true, and so we can at least be certain about that.
All right.
I mean, can you have different levels of interpretation? So like one from the scientists is like a mechanistic, and then the other one is, I don't know, maybe more of like a metaphysical, I suppose.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, that way you don't necessarily have a conflict. But doesn't it get into the question of like primary causation versus like secondary causation?
Right. So, and that kind of gets at the heart of what is obviously being stated here by anybody who understands what's going on, right? Is the statement that the Prophet ﷺ said in some way contradicting or going against the claim that these individuals are making on the basis of sense perception and a type of rational explanation, or the arithmetical demonstrations that they're using? The answer is no. Okay. Why? Because they're talking about this thing from two completely different perspectives. Like, really, someone who says like, see, we know that that's not what's happening. It's God manifesting himself to it. That's what's actually happening. Really? Is that what the hadith is actually saying? Like, it's providing a type of naturalistic explanation as to what's going on in the celestial spheres? Really? Has any scholar of Islam ever interpreted the hadith like that? The answer is no. Okay. And so, in other words, there's a conflation of what the astronomers are positing to what this metaphysical statement is positing. And this distinction or this separation is what Imam al-Ghazālī solidifies, kind of in a way, as the way in which Muslims should begin to think about what's going on here. Okay? They're not saying the ultimate or efficient cause of this is the empirical and rational explanation that we're giving. They're saying it's a completely sound empirical and rational explanation. What is the ultimate explanation of this, i.e., who created it, who created these celestial spheres, and who created it to behave like that, and who's in charge of it and controlling it? And that's not even in their purview. That's the purview of metaphysics. And so that's what Imam al-Ghazālī is trying to get us at. وَلَيْسَ فِي هَذَا مَا يُوجَبْ إِنْكَارِ عِلْمِ الْحِسَابِ وَالْمُعَرَّفِ لِمَسِيرِ الشَّمْسِ وَالْقَمَرِ. Okay? Point blank. This is not something that necessitates a refutation of what these philosophers are stating when it comes to their understanding of eclipses. وَاجْتِمَاعِهِمَا أو مقابلتهما على وجه مخصوص. This is something that we're looking at from a particular perspective. أما قوله عليه السلام ولكن الله إذا تجلى لشيء خضع له فليس توجد هذه الزيادة في الصحة أصلا. And so he kind of also says, and about this part of the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, if Allah manifests himself to anything, it humbles itself before him. Well, this is not actually sound. It's not a sound part of the hadith. Okay. So this is just kind of like an added thing that he puts in there. He also talks about this in some more detail. And actually, one can say that you can look at these two accounts. So he talks about this in Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. And when you look at what is being written here and what is also being written in the incoherence, and also you see this in a variety of other things that he's writing where he's using some of these exact same points. You understand the point that he's trying to make, and it becomes much more clear when you've read all of them, right? This is, by the way, not him denying, because I've heard this, somebody said this about him as well, and it was published, that portion of the hadith, if it disagrees with reason, then Imam al-Ghazālī says that we have to deny it. That's absolutely not what he's saying. Okay? Nor is he actually claiming, when it comes to this issue, that one has to reinterpret the metaphysical claim. No. He's saying one of these claims is providing a naturalistic explanation, and the other one is a metaphysical explanation. Don't conflate these two explanations. Finished. All right. هذا حكم الرياضيات وآفاتها. So this is the judgment, the understanding that we have, the ruling on mathematics and the issues that emerge from one delving into them. Any questions about this?
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
So, I feel like the problem in our current world is that the naturalistic explanation is the only one.
Correct.
So, right. So how do you, and I kind of think that there's no, I don't know how you go back from that in the intellectual climate. Right. I don't know how you go backwards, because now the kind of dominant idea is that, like, not only is there no such thing as like a non-material explanation, but like kind of like you were alluding to with the cross, like even the idea that there could be like a, I don't know, like a teleological one or like something that's not material is kind of like laughed at because we've quote unquote progressed past non-material explanations. So I kind of feel like the challenge in our time is like, well, how do we, because I've run into this in talking with some Muslims in like college, where it's like, you know, like the idea of, or even not just Muslims, just people in general, the idea of a non-material explanation for something. Right. So how do we even have that conversation?
Well, again, the parameters of the question that would be asked are fundamentally different than the ones that are being asked when it comes to empirical science, right? So like when you ask, for instance, the question, yes, you know, I understand that there's a particular naturalistic explanation that's given as to, you know, how eclipses occur. But how did the sun even, how did the sun, you know, get here? Like what created the sun? And as a matter of fact, what created all of this? You know,
well, they usually take the physical universe for granted in the same way that we take, I wouldn't say we take a law's existence for granted, but we just assume that a law exists. Whereas they it's almost like they do the same thing with the physical material universe that we do with the law. They just sort of assume that it's there.
Well, so yeah, that's a good point. But, you know, we don't, so the one thing that I would say is that we're not assuming anything. What we are actually, in terms of our theology. So were you in the theology class before this one?
No, but I kind of wish I had been.
Yeah.
Sorry. But I've read a lot of this stuff, and so yeah.
Yeah. So the theology class, you know, elaborates on this point that you're making here, and gives us an explanation. I mean, what is it that we are we assuming certain things? And, you know, Imam al-Ghazālī gives a much more in-depth treatment to some of these issues. That's why we're looking at this paper, this text that he wrote. But we would say of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that his existence is necessary, and that we are able to arrive at that conclusion vis-a-vis a purely rationalistic means. That one must arrive at the understanding that there must be a necessary being that created all of this, i.e. is not of this, it's not contingent like all of us are. All of creation is anything that is physical, spatially located. Therefore, they posit that there's something beyond this, that existence is necessary. And from there, then, based on the particular premises that they use, they're going to continue to show you how that necessary existence is in fact Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the question becomes, you know, we provide an explanation as to why that which created everything that is contingent is itself not contingent and necessary, i.e. outside of beyond that which is contingent. But you are assuming that which is contingent, the world itself, created itself. And the problem with that, on the merit of the, you know, rational laws, one can say, is that you're going to end up in one of two primary flaws. Either
infinite regress, or
exactly infinite regress, what's known as a self-generative claim. Those two are going to be things that you can't, escape. The only way to do it is to say that there's something that's necessary, all right, and is not contingent. And so if it's not contingent, i.e. it doesn't have spatial location, it's not something that's changing and in need of something else in order to bring about its own existence, then what are we talking about? We're obviously not talking about anything that is within the realm of creation. And so that's how they bring about the conclusions that they bring about. So they do prove it through the unmediated intellect. It's intelligible, it's highly rationalistic, and it works. Versus those who tried to make the claim that it's the world itself that did it. And what's interesting is that given kind of the evolution of where science is today, the sort of predominant model of science today, is one of materialism, right? And so materialism is actually making the claim that we can't actually make a claim about the world, i.e. the physical reality, through our observations, empirical observations, that are not themselves empirical. So if I'm going to try and make a claim that the world created itself, then really what I'm trying to claim is that there's something about the world which has an inherent nature that brought about its own effect. And ask any materialist scientist, they'll tell you they don't accept that premise, because you can't make that type of a claim and still hold to a materialist stance on science, i.e. it's how do I know that this thing has a nature? I don't know that. I'm claiming that it does, but I can't empirically verify that. But I can
it's a metaphysical claim.
Exactly. What I can empirically verify is that this thing has a relationship to other things, and these are correspondences that seem to constantly occur. We understand it. Given this set of data, we create a model based on the data that we have to properly represent what's going on. When there are outliers to the system that go beyond the scope of us making sense of the data, we either shift the model or we scrap the model and we come up with a completely new model. That's science, and that's what materialist science comes up with. And that is honestly what the advent of modernity brought about in terms of the way that science was going to work and why they were able to, in many ways, achieve the type of scientific achievements that they were able to come to. So I doubt that they're going to go back to the idea that, there's some sort of inherent essential cause within these physical things that you cannot empirically verify, that we're just going to run with because we just don't want to claim that there's anything else outside of the world that created the world. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. I mean, there's a number of explanations today when you look at the subject of philosophy of science. For instance, you have a number of different theories people are trying to postulate and solve some of the issues that they have. I mean, the biggest issue right now is the fact that the orthodox position in physics is the Big Bang. And so the rational, the sort of like entailment to the idea of there being a Big Bang is for you to ask, well, what caused the bang? And so at that point, you have now a number of individuals who are kind of scrambling to try to find explanations that they know don't really work all that well. And so it's kind of a mess.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for the class. It was really good. And yeah, mashallah, it's very good. So I know that there's a lot of that what we talked about the whole, like, I think nowadays instead of math, it's more like science. If science says something and religion goes against it, then religion must be wrong, kind of thing. So I was wondering if there's been like a book that, well, I have one particular hadith in mind that I haven't been able to find how we reconcile that with science. But overall, has there been like a recent book written about all the scientific hadith? Like, for example, like the hadith that says that like the shooting stars are like missiles of thrown by angels at the shayateen and stuff like that. Because if we believe science and that those are like suns, like distant suns, that's like physically impossible unless the shayateen is like huge. So, like, so I'm just wondering. So two questions. One, can you answer that hadith? Because it's been bugging me for a while. And two, is there any book recently written on these things? Thank you.
Yeah, as far as literature is concerned, I mean, there are certain texts that have been written. I can't really think of any off the top of my head that aren't like extremely academic. But maybe I can get back to you about that in terms of the literature. As far as parsing the hadith, I'm gonna ask you the question, given what we've now taken in this class. What do you think Imam al-Ghazālī's reply to your question would be? It's not all that different. I mean, beyond the kind of content of what the hadith is, compare that to the hadith that he gives in terms of providing an explanation as to why those who are using this to refute the science are misguided.
I guess there's, like we said, primary causes and secondary causes. Something that I was following what you're saying. I don't know how to really say it myself.
Well, hold on. Yeah. Let's not call it secondary causes, because that's gonna bring up a whole slew of other issues. But
all right, okay.
But yeah, so when you think about it in terms of the naturalistic causes versus like ultimate causes, just to make it simple.
Okay.
Right. These are two different things, right? So when one is postulating physics, i.e., that which we are able to understand or discern vis-a-vis our empirical observations of the world, and through rationality, we're able to devise ways to understand what's going on here, versus claims that are being made that are obviously metaphysical in their nature. Okay, so one is talking about the celestial world insofar as gas forms and how they move across the sky. The other one is talking about shayateen, okay, being thrown, the angels throwing stars at the shayateen. So obviously, one of them is speaking from within the perspective of a metaphysical claim. Okay,
Right.
This is not trying to elaborate on science, so to speak. This is not trying to say like, here's our scientific explanation, i.e. the naturalistic or empirical understanding of what's going on. This is talking about something that goes beyond that, metaphysics, that which goes beyond the natural explanations of things. All right. And so Imam al-Ghazālī would simply say the same thing. Look, separate between these two. What's happening in this hadith is not some alternative model to what scientists are proposing. And if scientists are proposing what they're proposing, that's fine. But you have to understand, is what they are actually giving us something that we can claim is absolutely certain or not? When it comes to science, natural science like this, most of the things that are being claimed are not absolutely certain. And scientists know that. It's not. This is not something that scientists are like unaware of. They know that this is not absolutely certain.
Yeah, I remember when I was at my school, one of my teachers was a Muslim and an astronomer, and he said that like if you actually take Copernicus's and the guy who was after for him, I forgot the two astronomers, but one was a heliocentric, one was a geocentric. They actually kind of come down to the same conclusions. Like you can actually use both to like explain things pretty well, like pretty accurately and stuff like that. So I'm open to the idea that maybe stars aren't suns that are I'm open to that idea. it's just very uncomfortable to think that science is wrong about something like that, you know? Because it's
Well,
like,
again, it's not. So the way that I would advise us to understand the hadith is not something that is trying to give a scientific explanation. It is giving a metaphysical explanation of something. And so long as you separate between the explanation that's being given by the scientists and the explanation that's being given by metaphysicians, you're not going to run into problems. I mean, Imam al-Ghazālī is going to elaborate more as to like how those two things, the interplay between those two things actually do play out, and what to keep in mind then in relationship to the way in which this is all going to work.
Okay. Thank you. That actually helps a lot. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a real quick question. I don't know if it's a quick answer, but how much of this confusion is related to certain, I guess, ideological trends that we've taken from some of our Christian brothers and sisters in terms of like literalism, and how much is actually native to us as like Muslims? Because, I was even thinking of Surah Ar-Rahman, like where Allah says that, the stars and the trees like prostrate, they both prostrate to him.
Mm.
There's a wealth of like tafsir on that. Like obviously there's like the literal, going all the way to like sort of, deep Sufi stuff, right? It seems like we kind of lost that ability, or I don't know, it's kind of seems that way because it just kind of seems like the scientific paradigm has kind of like overshadowed like the sort of interpretive traditions that we actually have as Muslims. But I was curious what you thought about that, because I feel like a lot of the confusion potentially comes from that.
The confusion comes from the idea that we're appropriating literalism from.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
in a particular type of literalism vis-a-vis like scientism and the ascendancy of like science in the West, and the reaction to that by particularly Protestant Christians.
Yeah.
We live in a Protestant Christian country.
Yeah. So I see them as two separate issues. The first one is an issue of what's known as hermeneutics, or like how does one interpret from the source text of Islam. The idea of literalism is obviously, it's cognate as something that is it's intrinsic to a very Catholic Christian worldview. You're right. Muslims understood from an usuli perspective, which is the methodological science that they use to talk about how one approaches the Quran and Sunnah, Hadith and whatnot. It assumes a literal understanding on many issues, and from there begins to, kind of show you that there are obviously statements that are being made that could not be taken in that manner, and there's a whole system that was devised in order for one to understand how to do that, to do it properly. Arabic language becomes a huge part of that. But that's actually quite separate from, whether or not Muslims were going to think about the world, i.e. like their sort of empirical study of the world in that light. And this is also one of the reasons why ilm al-kalam, or Islamic theology, becomes such a central subject matter for one to have a proper foundation. When we talk about the world, i.e. the extramental world, the physical world, how one comes to know certain things about that world, we know comes from one of the three sources of judgments. And that source of judgment we would call empirical judgments. Empirical judgments, we understand, come about through our observations of repeated patterns in nature. So if I'm going to know something about, when I let go of this cup, for instance, what's going to happen? Well, I know that it's going to fall down. How did I know that? I know that through empirical observation. Okay. It's sort of an empirical judgment that I know is going to happen. Now, what's interesting is that this is just one of three sources of judgments that Muslims are, mainstream Sunni Muslims are going to allow for. The second one are known as rational judgments. And these are things that I can come to know without having to empirically verify it, i.e. that half of 2 is 1, or that an object cannot be both at rest and moving at the same time. These are things that I know necessarily vis-a-vis the unmediated intellect, okay, and kind of the certain first principles that I know intuitively that I'm using in order to come to these conclusions. I don't need somebody to tell me these things, and I don't need to empirically verify it to know that that is something that absolutely holds. These are rational conclusions or rational judgments. And lastly, legal judgments, revelatory judgments, things that the only way that I can come to know it is that, God sends a prophet and the prophet tells us that this is the case. Like there's 5 prayers a day, Dhuhr prayer is 4 rak'ahs, that so on and so forth, right? There's going to be a life after this life, that you're going to be held accountable for the things that you've done in this life, and you go to heaven or hell. These are things that I come to know only through the source of revelation, all right? And so the mutakallimun, or the Islamic theologians, set up a framework that allows for one to be able to, their point of departure becomes a rational endeavor, and also somewhat of a empirical endeavor, that through my basic sense perceptions, I'm able to derive necessary entailments on the world through means of the rational method that then brings me to an understanding of God and his attributes and prophets, and that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is a true prophet, and that the Quran, that which he brought from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is absolutely true in everything. And so I accept the Quran on that merit. And so it builds this framework that allows me as a human being to know that I have a variety of ways that I can come to know certain types of things. But it also gives me a proper boundary of understanding what is it that I actually know. For instance, when I say that when I let go of this cup, it falls down. Does that mean that this cup has some sort of intrinsic reality to it that necessarily must go down? The answer to that question, according to Sunnis, is absolutely not, right? And so it's on this very basis that they actually provide this category known as an empirical judgment that allows for the things that we know of the empirical world to be empirically based or empirically set. That I'm not making claims about things in the empirical world on the merit of what it is empirically that I can't actually substantiate empirically. You get what I'm saying? So they become much more empirical about their observations of the empirical world. And as such, they also understand, what type of relationship the empirical world has with the alim al-ghayb, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relates to all of that, is in control of all of that. And it allows for this very consistent and coherent framework to manifest in the way in which one understands all of reality. So, I would say that Muslims, particularly in this day and age, have kind of fallen outside of their understanding of that. And it was such a foundational thing in the way that traditional Muslims understood their religion in the world. And with the advent of the Copernican revolution and the Western world kind of developing in the way that it developed, and bedrocking that in their ability to develop scientifically, and the developments in technology, for instance, has constantly made, I would say, the majority Muslim world constantly feel like the way forward is science. And so what that's done is it's created this sort of very weird type of synthesis that many scholars in the modern period have attempted, which is to, make the Quran a book of science and kind of think about what the Quran is saying to us in a way that could be interpreted almost to show that, it's making scientific claims and that it can be proved through our reading of it and our understanding of science. that has never really been the way that Muslims have understood their source text. They recognize that these are two different things. They're not attempting to try to claim the same things. Science is science. It's based on empiricism, observations of repeated patterns in nature, and creating models that account for the data. Religion, these texts are primarily for the individual to have an understanding that connects them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and gives them an ultimate understanding of everything that's going on around them, right? The things that the empirical world and empirical observations are insufficient in allowing for one to arrive at, including the intellect. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think that that's part of the issue that's going on here. And it really calls for just the return to an understanding that Muslims had of their tradition in this very sophisticated manner, and of the rational sciences within that tradition. And that's why, Imam al-Ghazālī is such a significant figure in all of this, because he gives us an understanding of what those things are, that allows us to very eloquently and sophisticatedly engage with all of these different sectors of life. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam a'lam. Wallahu sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sallam. We're going to end here, inshallah, because it's 8:25. And I know that some people had to leave early, so but khair. Anybody have any last comments or anything? Good to see everybody. Anthony, good to see you. Abdullah, Hanan, Aaron, Ahlam, Majid. See the Yusuf. Alhamdulillah. Keep us in your prayers, inshallah. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow this knowledge to be of benefit and to allow us to benefit from it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be bearers of light and to allow that light to reflect on all of those that we come across. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect our families and to protect our communities and to protect us from all of the ills and ails. Ya Rabbil Alameen. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to revive in us an understanding of our religion, and one that allows for us to advance ourselves and our communities and our families. بإذن الله تعالى وصلى الله وسلم على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. فاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Barakallahu feekum. Forgive me for moving very slow. We did one of the 6 so far. We're going to move faster, inshallah. Or I may just have to skip through this so that we're not, trying to do this entire thing in Allah barik feekum. Are you both together? I just saw that. MashaAllah.
Yeah, he's visiting from Colombia.
Oh, okay. Alhamdulillah, salama.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, good to see you. How was the flight here?
Good. Alhamdulillah, it was just 9 hours. We made it. Alhamdulillah, it was good.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
Barakallahu
feekum. What's that?
We want to see you.
Yeah, inshallah. Soon, hopefully, inshallah. These 2 kids aren't letting me see or do anything, to be honest.
Alhamdulillah, it's good.
So keep us in your prayers. Allah barik feekum.